Today I'll be talking about a little study we did using data that was already collected and a couple others we gathered on land coverage and elevation. So the rationale for this is that if we look at PRRS and the progress we're making, this is data coming from the National Volunteer Control Project, and we see that in the last 3 years, so if you look at 2014, 15, and 16, we had a very similar incidence or occurrence of new outbreaks of PRRS, taking into account the basically herds spread throughout the whole country. So that makes us think, are we doing everything we can? Are we missing something? What are the risk factors for the transmission of PRRS at the herd level from herd to herd? And we know that PRRS is challenging and it's complicated, and the industry causes huge damages, and we're trying to control and even eliminate PRRS for a long time. But there's a lot of issues associated with it. And just to cite a few, we know that if a farm gets infected, other farms can get infected just by the movement of the animals themselves that are carrying the viruses, or sometimes just via fomites, so anything, a truck, anything the farms share, personnel, etc. And for PRRS, we know it's an airborne virus too. So we have this regional transmission from farm to farm via air. So the idea for this particular project came from meetings with a specific producer, and he asked me the questions. We were talking about risk factors for PRRS and as little we know and how to prevent, and there's a lot of anecdotal observations for a lot of those transmission events. And the producer asked me, oh, well, I have the option, and I'm building a new barn, and I have the option of either buying it at the top of the hill or at the bottom of the hill. What would you do, considering what you know for PRRS? And I thought about it, and I said, well, I have to get back to you on that one. I didn't remember anything talking about elevation of the land and risk for PRRS breaks. So I went back to the office and I did a quick search, and I said, well, I couldn't find anything really. I saw some things for vector-borne diseases and other pathogens, but for PRRS, nothing was reported that I could find. But we had a data set, which is from the data that I presented earlier today, that we had locations of farms across the states, and I could get probably that data on elevation and land coverage from other things that are available through the other sources that I'll talk in a few slides. So why not? So the objective for this one was to investigate whether land elevation and coverage were associated with PRRS breaks. And very importantly, we wanted to make sure we account for things like peak density that we know have a huge impact on the occurrence of PRRS breaks. And like I said, we had data from across the country, which made our study more valid or representative. So the methods, we used data from this national control project for PRRS, and we had a total of 706 sow farms that were sharing PRRS status on a weekly basis, so we could see how many outbreaks they had in a period of time. And the variables of interest, like I've already talked about, land elevation, land coverage came later on, also based on some of the readings I was doing. And then we wanted to make sure we accounted for swine density as well as this regional effect, so geographical region the farms are at, and then herd size also available from the SHAMP database. So this is so you can have an idea of where those sites were located. This is just farm density across the states from participating farms. So we see we have some groups here in the eastern part of the country, and we have the high swine producing regions over there represented as well, and some other pockets in other states. And if we compare that with the FAO modeled peak density from 2005, we can see that we're doing a pretty good job in terms of capturing those important regions in our source population from our project. So let's talk a little bit about how I captured those risk factors or those predictors that I was interested on. And when I started reading about elevation, I saw that really there's two ways of capturing this variable. One of them is an absolute number, so I would call that altitude, and it refers to how many meters above sea level are the farms located. So in this picture, for example, you see this farm is on the top of the hill, this one is at the bottom of the hill, and they could be anywhere above sea level. So let's say 80 and 86 meters above sea level. Another way of looking at altitude is a relative number. So it's actually talking about the steepness of the land or compared to the other features of the areas or the inclination of the land or the terrain. So in that case, it's actually a calculation, and you have to specify a certain range around your farm, and you have a rise and a run, and basically you apply a very simple formula, and you come up with this percentage or a degree. So I'm going to refer to that as a slope. And so that you have an idea of how steep are these numbers, if we're talking about a 30-degree slope, that refers to a grade of 58%, and that's considered pretty steep. And just so you put it into perspective, we can have farms that are situated in higher altitudes, let's say those two farms over here, but if you compare the neighborhood, they could still have a slope of 0. So how is this calculated? Well, thankfully I didn't have to calculate these slopes myself, but I read there's rasters available that we can get from different sources. And what it does basically, it divides the earth into grids, and in this case we were using about 10-kilometer grids. And then it looks for each cell, and it compares it to the neighbors in a very complex algorithm that I'm not going to go through today. But it basically considers the median and then calculates a slope for each cell in the earth, pretty much. So this is how this raster looks like. So I could basically get it from the FAO database, and I can just download it in my computer. And then I can plot my farms on top of it and extract those values for each of my farms. So I have this measure of the slope of that particular location. And here we have a distribution, and the different colors are the different categories for the slope. As you can see, for our farms, we didn't have anything that were 30 to 45%. But our farms are kind of distributed kind of all over the place there, with the majority being a 5 to 8% slope. The next variable that I already talked to you about and defined was the altitude. So this is represented on this map, and we see the darker colors are the higher altitudes. And in this case, this raster was just a continuous measure throughout, and then I just categorized it based on the quartile. So I had 20% of my farms in each one of those. And this data, I forgot to mention, this data is coming from different sources, and then it's managed by different organs. So the base source for this data is the NASA shuttle that they sent a mission back in 2006. And a combination with the USGS Geological Survey as well. So this data is coming from the early 2000s to mid-2000s, just so you have an idea. The other feature that we were interested was land coverage. And we found a raster that it was produced by the European Commission, and they had a huge global land project, again in the early 2000s as well. And basically what this does is it divides again the whole Earth into 22 different categories in terms of coverage. And for our purposes, because we had the vast majority of our farms were in cultivated and managed areas, which are basically soybean or cornfields or basically any crops. But we had to clump them together into broader categories. We didn't have enough sample size to use those 22. So in the end, these are the 4 that we were considering. So the first one, a majority of our farms, cultivated managed areas. Then we had a second category, which were more shrubs or short trees or herbaceous cover, which also includes pasture. And then we had 2 different categories for tree coverage. So we had the needle-leaved or mixed trees, and we had broad-leaved trees. So the outcome of interest for us, we used all those 700 herds from the SHAMP database, and we looked at how many times they broke over the time they were participating in the SHAMP. And we used a Poisson regression model for that, and it's quite neat because we can use this count data, so this huge data over that many years, but we can also account for that in the model. So we can use something called offset that you can account for this difference in participation. We did first some univariable analysis to select our variables, and then we used a backward stepwise approach. We did all the data management using ArcGIS, and the statistical analysis we're doing using Stata. We know that farms are clustered within production systems, and in this case we had about 20 production systems. So we have to take into account that variable because we know that farms from the same production system tend to have more or less outbreaks accordingly. So we use the random effect to account for that. and statistical significance declared when P was less than 0.05. So I'll share some results with you today. Our mean number of outbreaks per year per site was 1.4. And we have 60% of the farms that reported at least one outbreak during their participation in the SHAMP, which means that 40% of those farms never reported an outbreak. So we see here the distribution of outbreaks. And these are the results from our final multivariable model. And this is a busy table, but I'm going to guide you through it. First of all, we had density and number of animals being significant in our model. And we see this was not surprising. People have described this before for PRRS. So as you go up in the density in terms of where your area is located, and when you look at the number of animals in your farm, this will increase your incidence rate for being positive for PRRS. And those were both significant. If we looked at land coverage, our reference here was cultivated managed areas because that's the one we had the larger sample size. So we're using crop fields as a reference. So when you compare any of those green categories, so either having shrubs, herbaceous cover, or any of those trees, it seems like they were protecting the farms of getting outbreaks. So this was kind of neat, and we didn't see it being described for PRRS yet, and those were all significant, statistically significant. Moving on to the slope, our reference was basically no slope, a slope of less than 1%. And we see that we don't see anything when we are comparing 2 to 8% with nothing. But once we get to about 9% and we go up on this inclination category, we see that it seems like the farms are also showing this protective effect on the incidence of PRRS. And that was statistically significant as well, just those two last categories. And finally, we had a region variable that was supposed to be there basically to account for this regional effect that we couldn't really capture in other way. But, and then we used Illinois region as a reference just because, like I said, we were interested more in controlling for it than describing it. But if we look at the results, we see that Minnesota and Iowa region also showed increased the incidence rate ratio compared to Illinois. And then other farms located in other areas, which could include anything in not very high swine producing areas, that was protected. Those herds seem to be protected from having outbreaks compared to Illinois, which was our reference. So the discussion is interesting. This study was a kind of an initial study. It's a cross-sectional data. We are using some, if you wish, you could call them a little bit old rasters, especially for the land coverage. But we used a huge sample of farms, so our sample size is big, and the farms are located all across the U.S. So there are some strains, even though it's kind of a preliminary study. But when you think about our results, so the slope result that we found on the land inclination, we could think about it from an airborne transmission standpoint, that maybe, you know, if you have a certain degree of difference in terms of the elevation of your farm to your neighbors, that could potentially make sense. But with talking with people that are working in this area, it's not that simple. There's a lot of things that interact with how air is moving through the air. So we need more studies there, and we need to capture where is the potential source farm, where is the potential recipient farm, how was the weather in the potential days of infection, etc. So this one is a little bit hard, but I think it could be biologically plausible. But it also, I see land inclination as a proxy for other things. So if you are in a more inclined area, you're probably away from main highways, for example, and you might have less traffic around your farm. The land coverage finding, it's really, it was never reported for PRRS that I could find, but it's not big news for the poultry guys, for example. We found some peer-reviewed papers that are describing trees as vegetative filters, not only for odor, but also for pathogens. And they went really hard on it, and they actually looked at the leaves and retention of ammonia and types of different leaves, etc. So those studies maybe could be done for PRRS as well, and we can see if that has an association with reducing breaks, maybe for other pathogens too. So the take-home message from our study was that we investigated whether land elevation and coverage were associated with PRRS breaks, and our conclusions was that highly inclined terrains, they seem to be associated with fewer breaks, as well as the presence of shrubs and trees compared to cultivated areas.